because Thursday was the day a man walked through her door who didn't look at her that way at all. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Red Hollow, Colorado. Autumn of 1883 was not a town that forgave weakness. It had been built on hard men and harder seasons on cattle drives that broke spines and winters that broke spirits on the simple brutal arithmetic of who owned land and who worked it. The town had a hierarchy as fixed and unforgiving as the canyon walls that surrounded it on three sides, and everybody in Red Hollow understood their position in that hierarchy, the way they understood the direction of wind instinctively without needing to be told. Mara Quinn understood hers. 28 years old, a seamstress operating out of a 12-foot by 14-foot shop on the unpaved western edge of Main Street. Daughter of a woman the town had buried 6 years ago, still owing debts to half the merchants on that same street. Mara was a large woman, broad-shouldered, heavy through the middle, with thick, capable hands that could thread a needle in near darkness and pull a crooked seam straight through sheer force of will. She was not the kind of woman Red Hollow celebrated. She was the kind of woman Red Hollow tolerated the way a town tolerates a necessary thing, the way they tolerate the blacksmith smoke or the mud after a hard rain. She had 2 lanterns and a cast-iron stove that fought the cold and usually lost. She had a work table scarred with 1,000 small cuts. She had needles sorted by size in a tin her mother had left behind, and thread in 17 colors wound around bone spools, and she had a reputation. A quiet, stubborn reputation for doing honest work at honest prices, even when the town gave her every reason not to bother. She charged what the work was worth. Not a penny more, not a penny less. That was the thing about Mara Quinn that Red Hollow had never quite known what to do with. On the morning the coat came in, she was already at her table before sunrise. The previous night, she had taken in 2 mending jobs, a pair of work trousers belonging to Clem Packer, the elderly man who swept the feed store, and a child's wool dress for the Ortega family, who had paid her with 3 eggs and a genuine look of gratitude that Mara had accepted without embarrassment. She worked by a single lantern because she was rationing oil. She worked without complaint because complaint would not repair anything. She heard the horse outside before she heard the door. It was not an unusual sound. Horses passed her shop all morning, every morning. But something about this one made her look up. The rhythm of the hooves was unhurried, deliberate. The sound of a man who arrived at his own pace and expected the world to wait on him, though not in an arrogant way. More like a man who had simply learned that rushing changed nothing. The door opened. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered. Not handsome, not wealthy, not the careful cut of his clothing, just tall and solid in the way of a man who worked his land with his own hands, rather than directing others to do it for him. He wore a canvas duster, the color of Old Creek mud, and the duster had seen considerable living. The left shoulder seam had pulled away from the body of the coat entirely along about 4 inches. There was a tear along the lower right side clean through where something sharp had caught the fabric. The cuffs were worn through to thread, and there was a stain along the front panel, dark old, the kind that had been treated but never quite eliminated. He stood in her doorway and looked at her with dark eyes that held no apology and no performance. "Heard you do good work," he said. His voice was low and unhurried like the horse. "I do," Mara said. She did not stand up. She did not smooth her hair or adjust her apron or perform any of the small anxious courtesies that the women of Red Hollow had been trained to perform for men of obvious means. She looked at him, and then she looked at the coat, because the coat was what was relevant. "Bring it here." He crossed the room in 3 strides and laid the coat on her work table. She examined it the way a doctor examines a patient systematically without sentiment. She turned back the collar. She ran her thumb along the shoulder seam and felt where the thread had simply surrendered after years of strain. She held the torn panel up to the lantern and looked at the weave. She checked the buttons, 3-bone 1 replacement that didn't quite match, which told her this coat had been repaired before and not particularly well. "Shoulder seam the right side tear and the cuffs," she said. "I can make the cuffs last another 2 seasons if you don't abuse them. The shoulder seam I'll do right this time. Whoever did it before used the wrong weight thread." She paused. The stain on the front I can reduce but not remove. Fabric's been set too long." "That's fine," he said. "What's the cost?" $1.50. He looked at her, not surprised, not calculating, just looking. "That's less than I expected." "That's what it costs," Mara said. "I don't charge what the market will bear. I charge what the work is worth. Come back Saturday morning." He reached into his vest and laid $2 on her table. "Keep the difference," he said. "No." She picked up the 50 cents and held it out to him. "I told you what it costs. $1.50. That's what I'll take." For a moment, he simply looked at her with that same unhurried expression. Then he took the 50 cents. "Silas Boone," he said. "I know who you are," Mara said, and she went back to her work. She did know who he was. Everybody in Red Hollow knew who Silas Boone was. He ran the second-largest cattle operation in the county, which had made him the subject of considerable interest among the town's unattached women of suitable social standing, and particularly among the town's widows. Petty Vance had reportedly sent him a pie 3 times in the past month. Clara Drummond had arranged to have her carriage break down directly in front of his property line on 2 separate occasions. The Alderman sisters had taken turns visiting his foreman, with invitations to social events. They clearly had no expectation the foreman would attend. Silas Boone appeared to have noticed none of it. He picked up his cattle operation from a man who'd gone bankrupt in the drought of '78, paid a fair price at a time when he could have paid much less, kept on most of the original hands, and had not, in 5 years of operating in Red Hollow, made a single enemy that anyone could name with confidence. He was not beloved in the warm public way of a man who performs his generosity for an audience. He was respected in the quieter, sturdier way of a man who simply does what he says he will do every time without drawing attention to it. Mara had repaired his coat and told him the price and refused his extra 50 cents, and she had gone back to her work and she had not given it another thought. Or so she told herself. Saturday morning he came back. "You're early," she said. She hadn't quite finished reinforcing the second cuff. "I can wait." He sat down on the bench along her wall, the bench she kept for customers, though most customers didn't stay, and he waited without fidgeting, without making conversation, without filling the silence with the performed pleasantries that men of his position usually deployed when they were uncertain of their reception. He simply waited. Mara finished the cuff. She examined her seam along the shoulder one more time. She shook the coat out and held it up in the lantern light, turning it slowly. "It's good work," she said, not to compliment herself, but as a simple statement of fact. "It is," he agreed. She handed it to him. He put it on, and she watched him roll his shoulder, testing the seam, and something in her chest did a quiet, involuntary thing that she immediately suppressed. He paid her the $1.50, exactly. "Much obliged, Miss Quinn," he said, and he left. He came back 3 weeks later with a pair of saddlebags that needed new stitching along the base. She repaired them. He paid the exact price she named. He didn't linger. He came back the week after that with a work jacket that had lost all its buttons and needed the collar replaced. On that visit he said, "You heard about the Packer place?" Mara looked up from the jacket. "What about it?" "Gerald Hall put in an offer. Clem turned him down twice. Word is Hall's not accustomed to being turned down twice." "Word is right," Mara said. She set down her work. "Clem's been in twice this week. Looks like a man who hasn't slept." "I noticed," Silas said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones they'd shared before. This one had weight. "Hall's been pressing along this end of Main Street for 2 years, Mara said. "The feed store, the Ortega property. Now Clem." She didn't say, "and my shop," though she could have. Hall had made her an offer 6 months ago that hadn't been an offer so much as a dressed-up threat, a number so low it was insulting, delivered with the particular smile of a man who expects the insult to land and doesn't care. "He's patient," Silas said. "He's strategic," Mara corrected. "There's a difference. Patient men wait. Strategic men arrange things so that waiting is your only option." Silas looked at her. "You've been watching him," he said. "I watch everything," Mara said. It's what I do. A seamstress who doesn't observe carefully doesn't sew straight. She picked up the jacket again. Your buttons will be bone. I've got a close match. He didn't push further. He paid her 2 days later when he came to collect the jacket, exact price, no extra, same as always. And he left, and Mara stood in the doorway of her shop and watched him ride out and thought about Gerald Hole and his strategic patience and the way the western end of Main Street was being quietly, methodically surrounded. She had been watching Gerald Hole for longer than she'd told Silas Boone. It had started with thread. 3 months earlier, a ranch hand named Roy Decker had brought in a pair of work gloves to be restitched. Roy was a talker, the kind of man who filled silence compulsively, and while Mara worked, he'd talked about the new job he'd just left out at the Sanderson spread north of town, and how the cattle up there had been restless, and how the counts had been coming in low, and how the foreman, a man named Dale Wick, had told them all to keep their mouths shut about it, because it was just natural drought losses, and management didn't want it becoming a panic. Mara had listened and stitched and said almost nothing, but she had remembered, because 2 weeks before that, old Harvey Brennan had been in. Harvey ran a small ranch adjacent to the northern canyon, and Harvey had mentioned in passing the same restlessness, the same low counts, the same instruction to keep quiet about it, delivered by the same Dale Wick, who was apparently managing stock across 3 separate ranches simultaneously, which was not in itself unusual, but was the kind of detail that Mara's observational mind had filed away without conscious decision. And then the week after Roy Decker, a woman named Fern Calhoun, whose husband ran a livestock transport operation, had come in for a dress alteration, and mentioned while being fitted that Tom had been asked to make 2 extra night runs up the North Canyon Road in the past month. Loaded runs, no manifest cash payment on delivery. And Tom had taken the money because money was money and questions were expensive. 3 separate threads. 3 separate visits. A picture assembling itself in the back of Mara Quinn's mind like a seam pulling together under careful hands. She had said nothing to anyone. Because she was a seamstress on the western edge of Main Street, and information without proof was just rumor, and rumor from a woman like Mara Quinn was worth exactly nothing in a town like Red Hollow. She needed more. She was still working out how to get it when the morning came, a sharp cold Wednesday in late October, when Gerald Hole walked through her door. She knew before he spoke what the visit was. His expression was the same as it had been 6 months ago. Easy, proprietary. The expression of a man walking through a room he already owns. "Miss Quinn," he said. "Mr. Hole," she said. She didn't stand. She didn't put down her work. "I'll be direct," he said. "I want this property. I'm prepared to offer you $800 and a week to relocate." $800. The property was worth $1,800 at minimum, even in a drought year. "The answer's still no," Mara said. "Miss Quinn." He took 1 step toward her counter. His smile didn't change. "You don't want to make an enemy of me. I don't believe I'm the one making enemies, Mr. Hall." She looked up at him all the way up, because he was a tall man, and she was seated, and she looked up at him without flinching. "I believe you walked into my shop and threatened me. Those aren't quite the same thing." $800, he said again. "Generous for a woman in your position." "My position," Mara said quietly, "is standing on ground I own. You'll have to excuse me. I have work." He held his smile for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked out, and the cold air from the open door hit her like a wall. She waited until the sound of his horse had faded. Then she set down her needle very carefully, pressed both palms flat against the scarred wood of her work table, and breathed. She knew what came next for Gerald Hole's enemies. She also knew she couldn't stop it alone. She spent the rest of that day working and thinking, and by evening she had made 2 decisions. The first was that she would begin writing down everything she remembered, every conversation, every detail, every thread in the small notebook she kept for supply lists. The second was that the next time Silas Boone walked through her door, she was going to tell him what she knew. She didn't have to wait long. He came in Friday morning with a vest that needed 2 new pockets. She handed him a cup of coffee from the pot she kept on the stove. She'd never offered him coffee before, and he registered the change without commenting on it, and she told him, She told him about Roy Decker and the Low Counts and Dale Wick, about Harvey Brennan and the Northern Canyon and the same foreman managing stock across 3 ranches, about Tom Calhoun and the night runs with no manifest and cash on delivery. She told him about Gerald Hole's visit on Wednesday and the $800 and the smile that hadn't changed. She told him without drama the way she reported the condition of a garment factually sequentially with the observations laid out in order so the pattern was visible. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How long have you been putting this together?" he said. 3 months, Mara said. 3 months, he repeated. He looked at the coffee in his hand. "You've been carrying this alone for 3 months. I had no proof," she said. "I still don't have proof. I have a picture. A picture isn't enough." "No," Silas agreed. "It's not." He set down the coffee. "But it's a start." He looked at her directly. "I've had 24 head come up missing off my north pasture since August. My foreman thought it was wolves. I wasn't sure." Mara looked at him. "Dale Wick ever approach your hands?" "Not that I know of." He paused. "Though I'm going to ask different questions now." "Good," Mara said. They looked at each other across the work table. Outside, Red Hollow carried on its morning horses' voices, the creak of wagon wheels, completely unaware that in a 12-foot by 14-foot shop on the western edge of Main Street, a seamstress and a rancher had just made a quiet, careful decision that was going to change everything. "The vest," Mara said. "Right," Silas said. "I'll have it Monday." "I'll be here," he said. And for the first time since she had known him, 4 visits 37 days, 4 honest transactions. Silas Boone smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that didn't perform itself, the kind that simply happened. Mara looked back down at her work. But she felt it, like a seam pulling straight. Monday came the way hard weeks always do in Red Hollow, without ceremony and without mercy. Silas was at her door before she had finished her first cup of coffee. She heard the horse recognize the rhythm of it now and had the vest ready on the counter by the time he stepped inside. He didn't reach for it. "Dale Wick manages stock for Gerald Hall," he said. No greeting, no preamble. "Not just the Sanderson spread. Hall owns a silent interest in 3 other operations north of the canyon. Nobody talks about it because Hall made sure the ownership's buried under 2 layers of names that aren't his." Mara set down her cup. "How'd you find that out?" "Ask the right people the right questions." He finally picked up the vest, checked the pockets without really looking at them. "My hand, Pete Gruber, he told me Wick approached him in August. Offered him extra money for what he called inventory management. Pete turned him down and didn't tell me because he didn't think I'd believe him over a foreman with Hole's backing." "Would you have?" Silas was quiet for a beat. "Probably not," he said. "That's the part I keep coming back to." She respected him for saying it. She didn't say so. "How many head do you think are gone?" she asked. "Across my spread, 60, maybe 70. But if Wick's been working the Sanderson operation and the Brennan adjacent and whoever else Hole's got a finger in," he stopped, did the math. "Could be 300-400 head total. Moved over 4 months. Slow enough that nobody screamed about it. 300 to 400 head. At current market, that was close to $12,000. Moving through the Northern Canyon at night, no manifest cash on delivery to Tom Calhoun's transport wagons." "Hole's not stealing cattle because he needs money," Mara said slowly. "He's doing it to collapse the operations, drive the ranchers into debt, then buy the land cheap." Silas looked at her. "That's what I think too," he said. "Took me until yesterday morning to see it that clearly. I've been looking at it for 3 months," she said. "You caught up fast." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile this time, something quieter. "You lay out information the way you lay out a seam, clean, sequential. Hard to misread." Mara said nothing. She moved behind her counter and opened the small notebook she'd been keeping. The supply list pages were at the front. In the back, written small and tight, were 3 months of observations dates, names, details, the threads of it all pulled together. She turned it around and set it on the counter facing him. He read it without touching it. He read it the way she would have read it, carefully from the beginning, not skipping ahead. When he finished, he looked up. "This is your proof," he said. "This is my memory," she said. "It's not the same thing. It won't hold up in front of a marshal without corroboration. We need the ledger." The ledger. Tom Calhoun mentioned the ledger. He said Wick kept records of the night run's dates, counts, payment amounts. Tom assumed it was for Wick's own protection. A man running an illegal operation for someone like Hull keeps records because records are the only thing keeping him alive if Hull decides he's become a liability. Silas straightened. "Where's the ledger?" "I don't know," Mara said, "but I know where Dale Wick sleeps." The silence that followed had a different quality than any silence they'd shared before. This one was the silence before a decision gets made. The kind you can't walk back from. "Mara," Silas said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name, and neither of them remarked on it. "What you're describing is dangerous." "I know what it is," she said. "Hull's not a man who takes interference quietly. I know that too." She met his eyes. "He came into my shop, Silas. He looked at everything I've built, and he offered me $800 for it, like he was doing me a favor. Like what I've built doesn't count for anything because of what I look like and where I stand in this town's idea of itself." She kept her voice even. "I'm not doing this because I'm angry. I'm doing this because it's right. And because if Hull keeps going, Clem Packer loses his place, the Ortega family loses their home, and this end of town gets swallowed whole." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He paid for the vest. He left. And Mara stood in her shop and felt the ground shifting under everything she thought she understood about her life in Red Hollow. The town noticed before the week was out. It was Petty Vance who said it first, loudly enough to be heard across the dry goods counter at Holbert's store. "Silas Boone has been seen at that seamstress's shop 3 times this week alone." She let the observation sit there, fat and deliberate, like a spider in the middle of a web. 3 times, and not for long visits either. Short ones. Purposeful. Clara Drummond, standing 2 feet away, with a bolt of muslin she had no intention of buying, shook her head slowly. She must have sewn something into that coat. The women around them laughed. Mara heard about it by Tuesday afternoon through Fern Calhoun, who had come in for a fitting and relayed the conversation with the careful neutrality of a woman who knew what sides existed and wasn't yet sure which one was going to win. "They're talking," Fern said. "People talk," Mara said without looking up from the hem she was pinning. "Petty Vance called you." Fern stopped. "I can imagine what she called me," Mara said. "Hold still." Fern held still. Then quietly, "Does it bother you?" Mara thought about that. She thought about it the way she thought about most things honestly, without the comfort of a prettier answer. "It used to," she said. "Now I mostly think about whether the things I'm doing are worth doing. If they are what Petty Vance says about me while buying muslin she doesn't change that." Fern was quiet a moment. "Tom told me something last night," she said. "He wasn't going to, but I think he's scared." Mara's hands went still on the hem. "Tell me," she said. Tom had been approached again. Not by Dale Wick this time. By one of Hull's men, directly, a wide, quiet man named Cord, who had come to the Calhoun property after dark and told Tom there would be 3 more runs before winter. Bigger runs. And that Tom would do them, or the Territorial Land Office would receive documentation suggesting Tom's transport operation had been running contraband for the past 2 years. Manufactured documentation. But documentation nonetheless. "He's going to do it," Fern said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He doesn't see another way." "He has another way," Mara said. "He just doesn't know it yet." She finished the last pin in the hem. She straightened up and looked at Fern directly. "When are the runs scheduled?" "End of next week. 3 nights starting Thursday." Mara nodded slowly. She needed Silas. She needed him that day, not in 2 days when he might naturally stop by. She thought about that for a moment, about what it meant that she was thinking of him that way, as someone she could reach for when something urgent happened. She pushed the thought aside. There was no room for it. She sent word through Pete Gruber, who had begun to make himself quietly useful in the way of a man who has decided which side of a thing he's on. The message was 3 words. Come this evening. Silas came at 6. She told him about Tom and Cord and the 3 runs. She told him without sitting down because she was too tense to sit standing at her work table with her hands flat on the surface the way they'd been the morning Hall had come in. Silas listened. When she finished, he said, 3 nights starting Thursday. That's 8 days. 8 days to get proof before the evidence moves north through the canyon and disappears. If we go to the marshal now without the ledger, Hall has 3 territorial judges who owe him money, Mara said. I know that because Judge Alderman's wife brought in a dress last spring, and she talks when she's being fitted. We go to the marshal without the ledger, and Hall buries it before the week's out. Silas was quiet. Then, you know where Wick sleeps. Boarding house on Creek Road, 3rd room on the left upstairs. He's there before 9 most nights because he rises before 4. She paused. I know because his landlady is Mrs. Henner, and Mrs. Henner has her curtains hemmed here every spring. This time, he did smile. And it was bigger than the last one. Mara Quinn, he said. This town has absolutely no idea who it's been ignoring. She felt something move through her at those words, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not warmth exactly. Recognition. The quiet shock of being accurately seen. We have 8 days, she said, because the feeling needed to be contained, or she would not be useful. So let's not waste them. They worked out the shape of it that evening, standing on opposite sides of her work table, speaking in low voices, though there was no one to hear them. Silas would go to Creek Road to look for any pattern in Wick's movements, times he left, times he returned, whether he kept anything in the shared common space of the boarding house. Mara would go to Tom Calhoun with a different offer than the one fear had left him with. And Pete Gruber, who had worked alongside 2 of Wick's men before being transferred to Silas's north pasture, would find out quietly whether any of those men had doubts they hadn't yet said out loud. It was not a perfect plan. Mara knew that. Perfect plans existed in the imaginations of people who had never had to execute one. What this was a workable plan built from available materials, which in her experience was the only kind that ever actually ran. She walked Silas to her door at 7:30. He stopped on the threshold and turned back. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. 6 months ago, when Hall came in the first time with the $800. What did you do after he left? She looked at him. I pressed my hands flat on the table and I breathed. And then I went back to work, she said. What else was there to do? He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. Then he nodded, once settled his hat, and stepped out into the evening. Mara stood in the doorway and watched him go. The town was settling into its nighttime sounds. Horses stabled, supper fires, lit voices muffled by walls and distance. It was the same town it had always been. The same hierarchy, the same calculations, the same Petty Vance making observations at the dry goods counter. But something had changed in it. Or maybe something had changed in the way Mara Quinn was standing in it. She wasn't sure yet which it was. She went back to her table. She had work. Wednesday passed. Thursday began. It was Pete Gruber who brought the news at noon, slipping in the back of the shop, with the particular look of a man who has heard something he wasn't supposed to hear and has thought carefully about what to do with it. One of Wick's men, Pete said. Fellow named Jasper Holt. He's got a wife and a baby over in the Sanderson bunkhouse. He's been making noise about walking away from the whole operation. Quiet noise. But noise. How quiet? Mara asked. Quiet enough that he hasn't been found out yet. Not quiet enough that I didn't hear it. Pete shifted his weight. He's scared Miss Quinn. He got in before he understood what it was, and now he knows what it is, and he's in too deep to get out clean. Mara thought about Jasper Holt with a wife and a baby, and the particular kind of fear that belongs to a man who has made a wrong turn and can't find the road back. "Can you get to him?" she asked. "Maybe," Pete said, "if someone tells him there's a way out." "Is there?" Mara said. Pete looked at her steadily. "You tell me, Miss Quinn." She thought about it. She thought about what Silas had said the night before a territorial marshal proper procedure, the difference between being a witness and being a co-conspirator. If he cooperates with the marshal, if he can put testimony behind the ledger numbers, yes. She paused. "There's a way out." "Then I'll get to him," Pete said. He left. Mara stood very still for a moment in the center of her small shop, the thread and needles and bone spools around her, the lantern burning low, and she felt the shape of the thing they were building, not just the case against Hall, but something larger. A web of people who had been separately afraid and were now quietly pulling together. A seamstress and a rancher and a ranch hand, and a frightened driver, and a man with a wife and a baby who needed a road back. She thought about what Silas had said. This town has absolutely no idea who it's been ignoring. She picked up her needle. She went back to work. Because the work was always there, and it would not do itself. And doing it was how she stayed tethered to the ground when everything around her was beginning to move. By Thursday evening they had 4 threads in hand, and 8 days were now 6. The first run was coming. Jasper Holt was thinking. Tom Calhoun was scared but listening. And Dale Wick's ledger was somewhere on Creek Road, behind a door Mara Quinn had never opened. 6 days. She had worked with less. 6 days became 5, the way trouble always accelerates, not gradually, but all at once like a seam giving way under pressure. It was never designed to hold. Pete Gruber came back Friday morning before Mara had opened her shop door. He knocked 3 times fast, which was not his usual knock, and she knew before she turned the latch that something had changed. "Jasper Holt is gone," Pete said. Mara went very still. "Gone where?" "Packed his wife and the baby out last night, took the wagon north toward Laramie, didn't tell anyone, didn't leave word." Pete pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands. "But Cord knows, Hole's man. He was at the Sanderson spread at dawn asking questions, and the way he was asking them—" Pete stopped. It wasn't the kind of asking where he expects to not find an answer. "Cord thinks someone tipped Holt off," Mara said. "Yes, ma'am." "Did someone tip him off?" Pete met her eyes. "I told him there might be a way out. I didn't tell him to run." "He made his own choice," Mara said, and she meant it without judgment, because a man with a wife and a baby, and a way out that was still uncertain, had done what any man with sense and love would do. She couldn't fault that. "The problem is Cord." "Cord's already pointed back toward town," Pete said. "He's going to start pulling at threads." They had 6 threads now, all of them connected, and Cord didn't need to find all of them. He only needed to find one. "Get to Silas," Mara said. "Now. Tell him the timeline moved." Pete left at a near run. Mara locked her shop door, something she almost never did during business hours, and stood in the center of the room with her notebook open on the work table, and thought hard and fast about what they had and what they still needed. The ledger was the spine of everything. Without it, what they had was testimony from a frightened driver, second-hand accounts from ranch hands who'd seen things they couldn't formally swear to, and the careful observations of a seamstress that a territorial court would dismiss in 30 seconds. With it, they had dates and counts and payment amounts in Dale Wick's own hand, and Jasper Holt's willingness to talk even from Laramie, even by letter, suddenly became corroboration rather than rumor. They needed that ledger before Cord's questions found a door to knock on. Silas arrived at 9:30. He came through the back. He'd started doing that 2 days ago without discussion because the front door faced Main Street, and Main Street had eyes. He looked at her face and read it correctly. "How bad?" he said. Holt ran. "Cord's in a town asking questions." She turned the notebook toward him. "We have maybe 2 days before Wick understands the operation is compromised and moves that ledger somewhere we can't find it, or destroys it." "Then we go tonight," Silas said. "Tonight," she agreed. "Mara!" He said her name the way he'd started saying it without announcement, just directly like it was a word he'd always known. Creek Road Boarding House. Wick's room. If we're wrong about the ledger being there, we're not wrong, she said. Mrs. Henner told me 2 weeks ago that Mr. Wick had asked her for a lock for his room. She thought it was peculiar because the boarding house had never needed locks before. She put it down to him being private. Mara looked at Silas steadily. A private man who locks his door in a boarding house where nobody else locks theirs is keeping something in that room. Silas was quiet for one beat. All right, he said. Tonight. They arranged it between them in 20 minutes, standing on opposite sides of her work table, and it was the most natural 20 minutes Mara could remember spending, not because it was easy, because it wasn't, but because there was no pretense in it. No one performing competence for the other's benefit. Just two people looking at a problem and dividing it honestly. Silas would handle Wick. Not violently, that was not the shape of it, and they both understood that. But Wick ate supper at Gracie Holbert's restaurant every Friday 7 o'clock, the same table, because men of routine are men of routine, and Dale Wick was nothing if not a man of routine. Silas would be there. He would find a reason to sit near Wick and keep the conversation going. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would read as deliberate, just long enough to extend Wick's absence from Creek Road. Mara would go to the boarding house. Silas looked at her when she said it. His expression did not change. This was one of the things she had come to trust about him, that he did not perform concern as a way of telling her what she was capable of. You know how to get in, he said. Mrs. Henner leaves the back entrance unlatched until 10 o'clock for her late boarders, Mara said. Third room on the left upstairs. The lock she installed for Wick is a standard sliding bolt. It can be worked from outside with a thin blade if you know the mechanism. Do you know the mechanism? I repair everything that comes through my door, Mara said, including 3 door bolts last spring. Yes, I know the mechanism. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, settled his hat, and started for the back. At the door he stopped. You see anything that doesn't feel right? He said. You leave. You don't wait. You leave. Same to you, she said. He almost smiled. Then he was gone. The hours between 9:30 and 7 o'clock that evening were the longest Mara had spent in recent memory, and she spent them the only way she knew how, working. She finished a pair of riding gloves for the widow Marsh. She relined a coat collar for Clem Packer, who had brought it in with the kind of quiet desperation of a man trying to maintain appearances while the ground shifts under him. When Clem handed her the coat, he held onto it for a half-second longer than necessary, and she looked at him, and he said, You hear anything, Miss Quinn, about Hole and what he's planning next? I hear things, she said carefully. Clem nodded slow. I've been hearing things too. He hesitated. Tom Calhoun came by my place last night. Said there were people working on it. Didn't say who. He looked at her. Was he telling the truth? Mara looked at the coat in her hands. At the worn collar she was about to make good again. Come back Tuesday for this, she said. And don't sell anything to anyone before then. Clem stared at her. Then something shifted in his face, some old tightness around his eyes, and he said, Yes, ma'am, very quietly, and left. She put down the coat and pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed for a moment. Then she picked it back up and kept working. At 6:15, she closed the shop. She changed into her darkest dress, not for drama, simply because dark fabric does not catch light and light is attention. She put her small folding knife in her pocket, the one she used for cutting thread, which was thin enough and rigid enough to work a bolt mechanism if you were patient and you knew what you were doing. She put the notebook inside her dress against her side. She walked out the back. Creek Road was 7 minutes from her shop on foot. She took 9 because she took the long way, and because she stopped twice to listen to the sounds of the town around her, and make sure the sounds were the right sounds, the ordinary sounds of a Friday evening in Red Hollow. Not the altered sounds of a town where something has gone wrong. Everything sounded ordinary. She went in through the back of the boarding house at 6:45, upstairs, third door on the left. The bolt was exactly as Mrs. Henner had described it, and exactly as Mara had imagined it, a standard sliding mechanism, the kind made at any hardware supply, the kind she had worked 3 times in the past year for customers who had locked themselves out of their own rooms. She worked the blade. Slow. Patient. The way she worked everything. And after 40 seconds, the bolt slid. The room was small. A single bed. A washstand, a trunk at the foot of the bed. A wooden chair with a coat draped over it, and a small writing table against the wall. On the writing table was a lamp unlit, and a tin box with a hasp. She crossed to the tin box. The hasp was locked with a small padlock, not a serious padlock, the kind that signals privacy rather than security. And her folding knife inserted just so, and leveraged along the hasp, pulled it loose from the wood after 30 seconds of patient pressure. Inside the box was the ledger. She knew it immediately, not because she had ever seen it before, but because she recognized what it was. A man's protection written in a careful accountant's hand, organized by date. She opened it to the first entry. August 4th, 43 head, North Canyon Road, payment $85 cash, received D. Wick. She did not read further. She understood it immediately and fully, every number, every date, every initial. She understood what it was worth. She put it inside her dress beside the notebook. She put the tin box back exactly as she had found it, hasp pulled almost closed. She relocked the room behind her. She went downstairs and out the back and onto Creek Road, and she walked not fast, not slow, the pace of a woman going home from a Friday errand, and she did not let herself feel anything about what she had just done until she was back inside her own shop with the back door locked behind her. Then she sat down on the bench along her wall and held the ledger in her lap and felt her hands shake. Just briefly. Just for a moment. Then she steadied them the way she had steadied them 1,000 times before, and she waited for Silas. He came at 8:45. She heard the horse and was at the back door before he knocked. He came in, looked at her face, and then looked at what she was holding. "You found it," he said. "August through last week," she said. 381 head total across 7 different operations. Dates counts, amounts his initials on every entry. She held the ledger out to him. "It's everything." Silas took it. He stood there and read the first 3 pages in the lamplight, and his expression went very quiet, in the particular way of a man containing something large. When he looked up, his jaw was set. "Hole's name isn't in here," he said. "No," Mara agreed. "It won't be. Hole's too careful for that. But Tom Calhoun has Cord's name, and Cord works directly for Hole. And Jasper Holt saw transactions that trace back through Wick to Hole's foreman on the silent interest operations." She paused. "Put all 3 together with this ledger, and a territorial marshal has enough to pull on the right threads. The rest unravels from there." Silas looked at her. "You've already worked this out. I've been working it out for 3 months, she said. Tonight just confirmed the last piece. He set the ledger down on her work table very carefully, the way you set down something that matters. Then he looked at her, not the ledger, not the work table, but her directly in the way he had a handful of times before that still caught her slightly off guard because it was such a complete look, the kind that didn't edit what it saw. "You walked into that room alone," he said. "You were keeping Wick at supper," she said. "That was the plan." "Mara?" "I know what I did," she said. "I knew what I was doing when I did it. Are you going to tell me it was too dangerous?" He was quiet a moment. "No," he said. "I was going to say thank you." She hadn't expected that. She absorbed it without showing that she hadn't expected it, which took some effort. "Wick will know by morning," she said, returning to the practical because the practical was safe ground. "Even with the hasp almost closed, he'll see it's been worked. We need to move fast." "I'll ride to the territorial marshal at first light," Silas said. "Lodge Pine's a 4-hour ride. I'll be back by afternoon with either the man himself or a letter that compels the local deputy to act." He paused. "Can you get to Tom Calhoun tonight and get him ready to talk?" "Yes," Mara said. "And the notebook. Your notebook with the 3 months of observations. I want to take that with me. She looked at the notebook on the table. 3 months of her mornings, her careful watching, her private certainty that something was wrong, and that it mattered, and that someone should do something about it. She picked it up and handed it across the table without hesitation. He took it. He looked down at it in his hand, this small notebook that was also in a way the shape of who she was, and he said quietly, "I'll bring it back." "I know you will," she said. He left. She stood in the center of her shop in the lamplight, with the ledger on the table between her and everything that came next. And for the first time in 3 months, she felt the full weight of what they had built together. The seamstress and the rancher and the frightened driver, and the man who had run north to Laramie, and the ranch hand who had decided which side he was on. She thought about Gerald Hull in his office on the good end of Main Street, sitting behind his substantial desk, with his substantial smile, entirely unaware that the girl who stitched coats had just pulled the spine out of everything he had spent 2 years building. Then she put on her shawl and went to find Tom Calhoun. Because the work was not finished, and it would not do itself. Cord found her the next morning. She was unlocking her front door at 7 a.m., same as every morning, when he stepped out of the gap between her shop and the building next to it and put himself between her and the door. He was a large man, larger than she'd imagined from Fern's description, with the particular blankness of expression that belongs to men who have made their peace with doing whatever they're told. "Mr. Hall wants a word with you," Cord said. Mara looked at him. Then she looked at the key in her hand. Then she looked back at him. "Then Mr. Hall can come to my shop during business hours," she said, and unlocked her door, and went inside, and did not look back. She heard him stand there for a full minute before he left. Her heart was going fast, but her hands were steady, and she held on to that distinction because it mattered. What her heart did was not something she could always control. What her hands did was entirely up to her. Silas was riding to Lodge Pine. Tom Calhoun had agreed to talk last night and said so with the relief of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. The ledger was safe. The notebook was with Silas. Every thread she had been pulling for 3 months was now in the hands of people who would pull it the rest of the way. All she had to do was hold the ground. She lit her lantern. She sat at her table. She picked up her needle. She held the ground. Silas rode back into Red Hollow at 2:30 in the afternoon, with Marshal Cade Horrigan of the Lodge Pine Territorial Office riding beside him, and 2 deputy marshals riding behind. Mara heard the horses from inside her shop. 4 horses, moving with purpose at the particular pace of men who have authority and intend to use it. She set down her needle. She went to her window. She watched them pass without allowing herself to feel relief, yet because relief was premature, and premature relief had a way of making people careless. Silas didn't stop at her shop. That was the right call. She had told him the night before, "If you come back with the marshal, go directly to Deputy Reeves at the sheriff's office. Don't come to me first. Don't give Hull anything to point at." He had listened, and he had done exactly what she said, which was one more item on a list of things about Silas Boone that Red Hollow had been too busy performing its own importance to notice. She went back to her table. She waited. The first thing that happened was that Dale Wick was arrested at noon. She learned this from Pete Gruber, who appeared at her back door 40 minutes after the marshals rode through with the look of a man watching something he had stopped believing would actually happen. "They took him out of the Sanderson spread," Pete said. Wick didn't fight it, just went quiet, the kind of quiet that means he knew it was coming. "He found the tin box this morning," Mara said. "Yes, ma'am. His landlady said he came down for breakfast looking like a man who'd seen his own grave." Pete paused. Cord was at the Hull property when the marshals went out. They're holding him for questioning. "And Hall himself." Pete's expression shifted. "Still at his office. Marshal Horrigan went in an hour ago. He came out 20 minutes later and Hall came out with him. Walking. Not in irons." Mara absorbed that. "Not yet," she said. "Not yet." Pete agreed. He hesitated. Miss Quinn-Hole's lawyer was already at the sheriff's office before the marshals even dismounted. Man named Garrett comes up from Denver. Fast man. Expensive fast. Mara had expected this. She had expected it the same way she expected a coat to resist when you pulled a seam that had been set for years. It didn't mean the seam wouldn't give. It meant you had to pull with more deliberate force. Tom Calhoun, she said. Is he ready? Waiting at the sheriff's office right now. Said to tell you he's ready. She nodded. She picked up her needle and put it down again and picked it up again because her hands needed something to do with the waiting. Pete, what's the town saying? Pete looked at the floor. Depends which end of town you're asking. He lifted his eyes. This end people are watching. They're not sure what to make of it yet. The other end. He stopped. Say it, Mara said. Petty Vance has been at the dry goods store since 10 this morning, telling anyone who'll listen that this is Silas Boone stirring up trouble to consolidate his own position, that he used a seamstress to do his dirty work. He said the last 4 words with the careful neutrality of a man quoting something that disgusted him. Clara Drummond said something worse. I won't repeat it. Mara kept her expression even. She had learned long ago that what Petty Vance said was not something she could control, only something she could outlast. It doesn't matter, she said. What matters is what Marshal Horrigan puts in his report. Yes, ma'am, Pete said. But his jaw was tight, and she understood that it mattered to him, which was its own kind of thing to carry. He left. She went back to her work. The second thing that happened came at 3:15, and it came in the form of Gerald Hall himself. She heard the front door and looked up, and he was there without cord this time, without the protective bulk of a man who does what he's told. Just Hall, in his good coat, with his composed expression and his substantial manner, and the particular stillness of a man who has spent 30 years controlling rooms by simply standing in them. He looked at her across the work table. She looked back. I underestimated you, he said. Of all the things she had imagined him saying, that was not among them. She kept her face still. What do you want, Mr. Hole? I want to know how much, he said. Everyone has a number. I've been in this business long enough to know that. Whatever Boone offered you... Silas Boone has never offered me anything, Mara said, except the exact price I asked for the work I did. Hole studied her. That's a nice story. It's the truth, she said. People who deal in truth tend to find that confusing. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not quite. More like recalculation. The ledger, he said. Wick's ledger. My name isn't in it. No, Mara agreed. It's not. Then what exactly do you think you have? She looked at him steadily. I think I have a marshal in your deputy's office right now taking Tom Calhoun's sworn statement about a man named Cord who works directly for you and who threatened Tom's family and his livelihood to secure his cooperation in moving stolen cattle. I think I have Pete Gruber prepared to testify that one of your men approached his colleague about what he called inventory management. I think I have Jasper Holt, who is currently in Laramie, and who has agreed in writing, delivered to Marshal Horrigan this morning, to provide a full account of what he saw and what he did, and who instructed him to do it. She paused. And I think I have 3 months of careful observation from a woman this town didn't think was worth watching. She set down her needle. Your name will be in the report, Mr. Hall. It just won't be in the ledger. The composure held for another 3 seconds. She counted them. Then something in his face did a small controlled collapse, not defeat, not yet, because men like Gerald Hole did not collapse publicly, but a shift, a recalculation of odds that had not gone the way he had calculated them. You've made an enemy today, he said. His voice was quiet, measured. You came into my shop 6 months ago and made that decision for both of us, Mara said. I've simply been dealing with the consequences. He looked at her for one more moment, then he turned and walked out. She sat down. She hadn't realized until she was sitting that her legs had been braced against the floor the entire time he was in the room. She pressed her palms flat on the table, the same gesture, the same steadying, the same deliberate breath. Then the back door opened, and Silas was there. He looked at her face. What happened? Hole was just here, she said. Every line in his body went tight. Are you? I'm fine, she said. He didn't threaten me. He tried to find out how much I'd take to walk away. I told him I wasn't walking anywhere. She paused. He knows about the Holt letter. Silas came fully into the room. How does he know about the letter already? He's a strategic man, Mara said. I told you there's a difference between strategic and patient. He's been moving information since this morning. The question is, what he does with it. His lawyer is already filing a motion to suppress Wick's ledger on grounds of unlawful search, Silas said. He sat down on the bench across from her table, his hat in his hands. Horrigan told me. Garrett, the Denver lawyer, is arguing the ledger was illegally obtained. Mara was quiet for a moment. She had thought about this. She had thought about it at 2 a.m, when she couldn't sleep, running the same possibility over and over. The ledger was in a room I entered without permission, she said carefully. That's true. But what it contains is evidence of crimes against property owners across this county, including evidence that directly affects operations that fall under territorial jurisdiction. She looked at Silas. Horrigan, is he a straight man? Straightest one I know in this territory, Silas said. That's why I rode 4 hours to find him, instead of going to the local deputy. Then give him this. She reached into her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She had written it that morning at 5 a.m. before she had opened the shop. I wrote out exactly what I did and why. The unlocked back entrance, the mechanism, every step. And I wrote out what I knew before I entered that room, every piece of testimony and observation that constituted probable cause in any honest reading of the situation. She held it out. A straight marshal with a strong case and a well-documented argument does not need the ledger to be the foundation. He needs it to be corroboration. Let Garrett argue about the foundation. The rest holds. Silas took the paper. He read it. When he looked up, his expression was the one she had come to know, the one that was not performed, the one that simply happened. You wrote this at 5 a.m. I couldn't sleep, she said. Useful insomnia. He looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, what would have happened to this town if you'd taken Hole's $800 6 months ago? Clem Packer would have lost his place by Christmas, she said. The Ortegas by spring. Your North Pasture head count would have kept dropping until you either sold or went under trying to investigate something you couldn't prove alone. She paused. It would have gone on until Hall owned everything on this end of town and half the operations north of the canyon. And you knew that 6 months ago. I suspected it 3 months ago, she said. 6 months ago, I just knew he was trying to take my shop and that I wasn't going to let him. Silas set his hat on the bench beside him. He looked at his hands. I've been running cattle in this territory for 5 years, he said slowly. I've sat in rooms with men who make decisions about this county's future. I've been on the town council twice. I've been to the territorial assembly. He stopped. And in all of that time, the sharpest, most complete picture of what was happening in this valley was sitting in a notebook in a 12-by-14 shop at the end of Main Street that I'd never once walked into before I needed a coat fixed. The room was quiet. You walked in when you needed to, Mara said. That's more than most. It's not enough, he said. And the way he said it, not self-flagellating, not performing guilt, just a plain accounting of fact, made it land differently than she was prepared for. She looked down at her work table. Take the paper to Horrigan, she said. Let's finish what we started. He went. She stayed. And the afternoon moved around her horses in the street, voices rising and falling, the ordinary sounds of a town that was quietly underneath all of it, remaking itself. The third thing happened at 5 o'clock. Clem Packer came through the front door with his wife on his arm, which he had never done before in all the years he'd been bringing her work, and he set a jar of preserved plums on her counter. Good plums, the kind you put up in summer for something worth celebrating. And he said, I hear we have you to thank. Mara looked at the plums. She looked at Clem and his wife. "You have yourself to thank," she said. "You turned Hall down twice when most men wouldn't have turned him down once." Clem's wife, a small, sharp woman named Ruth, looked at Mara with the particular expression of a woman who has spent 60 years accurately reading other women. "My husband said you told him not to sell anything to anyone before Tuesday," Ruth said. "He listened. That's not a small thing, that listening." She paused. "We know what you did. Maybe the rest of this town doesn't yet. We know." Mara pressed her lips together, because there was something in her chest that was entirely inappropriate to the professional setting, and she had no intention of surrendering to it. "I'll have Clem's coat ready Tuesday," she said. Ruth Packer smiled a small, knowing smile and let her husband guide her back out the door. Mara stood in the resulting silence and pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed. And this time, the breathing was not bracing. It was something else. Something quieter and steadier and harder to name. Marshal Horrigan filed his full preliminary report on Monday. Cord was held on material witness status. Dale Wick faced with the ledger, and Tom Calhoun's sworn testimony and the Holt letter from Laramie made the decision that men make when they understand clearly that the alternative is worse. He agreed to cooperate fully with the territorial investigation in exchange for consideration of his sentencing. His testimony named Gerald Hull directly. 4 specific transactions. 2 direct conversations. 1 meeting at Hull's office, in which Hall had outlined the entire scheme with the calm confidence of a man who was absolutely certain it would never see the light of day. Hull's assets north of the canyon were frozen pending investigation. His lawyer filed 3 separate motions in the first week. All 3 were denied. The territorial court, not the county judges who owed Hull money, but the territorial court in Cheyenne, which owed him nothing, appointed a special investigator. It was not fast. Justice in 1883 Colorado was not a fast mechanism. It ground slowly and it ground unevenly, and there were days when Mara heard something from Pete or from Fern that made the outcome seem less certain than it had seemed the day before. There were days when Hull's lawyer said something in a public filing that was designed to be read in the papers and to reframe the entire situation. And on those days, she felt the particular exhaustion of a long fight that isn't finished. But the cattle were being recovered. The territorial investigator had ridden north with 2 deputies and found 47 head-bearing altered brands at a holding facility beyond the canyon that Wick had identified in his testimony. The ranchers who had lost stock were being contacted. The accounts were being tallied. It was not nothing. It was in fact everything Mara had hoped for and worked toward and lost sleep over for 3 months. Red Hollow was not transformed overnight. Towns do not transform overnight. What they do is shift incrementally the way a seam moves under pressure, almost imperceptibly at first and then all at once. The shift on the western end of Main Street was a little faster than elsewhere. The Ortegas stopped Mrs. Ortega in the street one Wednesday to tell Mara that their land offer had been withdrawn. Hull's agent had simply stopped pursuing it quietly without explanation. Fern Calhoun came in for a fitting and sat for 20 minutes afterward, just talking the easy talking of a woman who has stopped carrying a secret and found the air lighter without it. Pete Gruber came by on a Thursday, not because he had information to deliver, but because he had fixed the latch on the alley gate behind her shop without being asked and wanted to tell her it was done. Small things. Honest things. The kind that don't announce themselves. Silas came on a Wednesday 2 weeks after the marshals had ridden in. He came through the front door this time because there was no longer a reason to come through the back, and he set a coat on her counter, a different coat, a newer one, but with a pocket that had been coming loose at the lower corner. "Pocket's going," he said. Mara looked at the pocket. "It is," she said. "Same issue as the shoulder seam on the old one. Wrong weight thread." "Can you fix it?" "Yes," she said. "Come back Friday." He looked at her, not at the coat, at her. "How are you doing?" he said. And it was not quite a question. It was the kind of statement that opens a door and leaves you to decide whether to walk through it. She thought about the honest answer. "Tired," she said. The kind of tired that's different from exhausted. More like the kind that comes when you've been holding something taut for a long time, and you're not holding it quite as tightly anymore. "That's a good tired?" he said. "It is," she agreed. He paid her for the work before she'd done it exact price, named by her no argument, and he left, and she stood at her counter and looked at the coat in her hands, and thought about the first coat. The old canvas duster, the color of creek mud, with the pulled shoulder seam, and the torn panel, and the mismatched button. The coat she had fixed in a single professional transaction that had led by a series of honest steps to everything that followed. She had charged $1.50. She had refused the extra 50 cents. She had gone back to her work. And somehow, without spectacle, without transformation, without becoming anything other than precisely what she had always been, everything around her had changed. She hung Silas Boone's coat on the hook by her work table, and lit the second lantern and went to work. Friday came, and Silas came with it. He collected the coat, checked the pocket corner, the way he always checked her work, not from doubt, but from the habit of a man who respects craftsmanship enough to acknowledge it, and he said, "It's good." "It is," Mara said. He paid. He didn't leave. She looked up from her table. "I want to ask you something," he said, and it was the same opening he had used once before, the night he had asked her what she'd done after Hull's first visit. She had learned that when Silas Boone prefaced something that way, he had already thought it through completely, and was asking because he wanted her answer, not because he was uncertain of his own position. "Go ahead," she said. "The town council is meeting next Thursday," he said. "They're discussing the western end of Main Street property assessments, the legal status of Hull's pending acquisitions, whether the county has grounds to restructure some of the arrangements he made under what the territorial investigator is now calling coercive pretense." He paused. "They've asked me to present the rancher perspective. I'd like you to come with me and present yours." Mara set down her needle. "The council hasn't asked me." "I'm asking you," he said. "The rancher perspective without the Main Street perspective is half a picture. You've known that from the beginning, so have I." She looked at him across the work table. A seamstress on the western edge of town standing in front of the Red Hollow Town Council presenting a perspective they had never once solicited in the 28 years she had lived among them. "They won't like it," she said. "No," Silas agreed. "Probably not. Does that change whether it needs to be said?" She almost smiled. "No." "Then you'll come." It was not quite a question. She answered it like it wasn't one. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." He left. She went back to her work. And for the rest of that day, underneath the ordinary rhythm of needle and thread and the small transactions of a Friday, in late autumn, something was moving in her, not excitement exactly, and not fear exactly, but the particular aliveness of a woman who has been asked to stand somewhere she has never stood before and has said yes without flinching. The council meeting was held in the Red Hollow Assembly Room above the land office, and by the time Mara and Silas arrived on Thursday evening, it was already full. She had not anticipated that. She had prepared herself for the council's 7 members and perhaps a handful of observers. Instead, every bench was taken, and people were standing along the walls, and the murmur of the room dropped to something lower and more complicated when she walked in beside Silas. She felt it the weight of the room's attention, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. She had felt it before in smaller rooms. She had always managed it by going very still inside herself while remaining completely deliberate in her movements. She did that now. She walked to the front bench beside Silas and sat down, and she did not look around the room, because looking around the room was what you did when you needed other people's expressions to tell you whether you were allowed to be somewhere. She already knew she was allowed to be here. Silas had asked her. She had said yes. That was sufficient. Council Chairman Alderman, whose wife had her curtains hemmed every spring, whose connections to Hull's financial network were currently under quiet scrutiny by the territorial investigator, looked at Mara with an expression that sat between discomfort and calculation. He looked at Silas. He looked back at Mara. "This session is for property stakeholders and their representatives," Alderman said. Miss Quinn is a property stakeholder, Silas said. She owns her shop on Main Street. She also has direct knowledge of the coercive acquisition practices under investigation, which is the subject of this meeting. Mr. Boone. I'd also note, Silas said in the same even tone, not raising his voice, not performing patience, simply being immovable, that Marshal Horrigan has indicated his office will be reviewing the minutes of this meeting as part of the ongoing territorial investigation. In that context, the council may want to consider carefully who it chooses to exclude and why. The room was very quiet. Alderman looked at his hands. The session will proceed, he said. Silas presented first. He laid out the rancher losses, head counts, estimated values, the pattern of targeted operations north of the canyon with the same methodical clarity he brought to everything. He cited dates from the ledger. He cited Wick's testimony. He cited the territorial investigator's preliminary findings. He spoke for 12 minutes and did not repeat himself once. Then Mara stood up. She had thought about what she wanted to say for 4 days. She had written it and rewritten it and finally thrown out everything she'd written and decided to simply speak because the truth she had was not complicated. It was just true. I have operated a shop on the western end of Main Street for 9 years, she said. Her voice was steady. She did not look at Petty Vance, who was sitting 3 rows back, with an expression like she'd bitten into something sour. She did not look at Alderman. She looked at the room in general the way you speak to a room when you're speaking to all of it, not just the friendly parts. In those 9 years, I have repaired the coats and boots and gloves and saddlery of nearly every family in this valley. I have sat across my work table from ranch hands and storekeepers and farmers and their wives. I have listened because listening is part of my work. What I listened to over 3 months was the shape of a deliberate scheme to collapse the economic independence of a specific part of this community, not through honest competition, but through theft, intimidation, and manufactured debt. She paused. I documented what I heard. I verified what I could. I brought what I found to a man who had the means to act on it, and together we brought it to a territorial marshal whose job is to enforce the law regardless of whose name is on the deed. She looked at Alderman directly. The question before this council is not whether the western end of Main Street matters. It clearly does. It matters enough that someone spent 2 years trying to own it through fraud. The question is whether this council intends to act in the interests of all the people in this valley or only the ones who have always sat at the front of the room. Boom. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Then from somewhere in the middle of the room, someone began to clap. A single pair of hands, slow and deliberate. She didn't look to see who it was. Then a second pair joined. Then a third. Then the room was applauding, and Alderman was looking at his hands again, and Petty Vance was staring straight ahead with her jaw tight, and Mara stood at the front of the Red Hollow assembly room and felt not triumph, because triumph was too loud for what this was. She felt the quiet, solid satisfaction of a seam that has been pulled straight after years of being worked wrong. The council voted that evening to petition the territorial court to nullify Hull's pending acquisition agreements on the grounds of coercive practice. The vote was 5-2. Alderman voted against. So did another man on the council, whose name Mara recognized from one of her notebook's earlier entries as having attended a meeting with Hull's land agent. She noted both names. She would remember them. She and Silas walked out of the assembly room into the cold November air, and for a moment they simply stood on the street without speaking. Around them, the town was releasing into the evening, people filtering out of the building behind them, voices low, the particular sound of a community that has witnessed something and is still deciding what to do with it. You threw out everything you wrote, Silas said. She glanced at him. How do you know that? Because what you said in there had no prepared edges, he said. Prepared speeches have edges. What you said was just true, straight through. She looked ahead at the dark street. Prepared speeches are for people who aren't sure of what they're saying, she said. I've been sure of this for 3 months. He was quiet a moment. Then, I'd like to walk you back to your shop. It's 7 minutes, she said. I know how far it is, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that complete, unedited expression, the one she had spent weeks understanding and had still not entirely found the floor of. All right, she said. They walked. The evening was cold and clear, the kind of cold that sharpens everything. Sounds, edges, the feeling of your own breath. They walked without performing the walk, without filling it with words it didn't need. Halfway there, his hand found hers. Not dramatically, not with announcement. Just there, the way honest things arrive, without asking permission, because they don't need to. She let it stay. They reached her shop. He stopped at the door, and she stopped beside him, and the town moved quietly around them, indifferent in the way towns are when they are busy with their own lives. I want to say something, Silas said. She waited. I came into your shop 6 weeks ago with a coat that needed fixing, he said. I thought I was coming for the coat. He stopped, looked at her directly the way he always looked at her without editing. I've spent 5 years in this valley keeping my head down and my operation running and my circle small. I thought that was the right way to do things. I thought staying out of what didn't directly concern me was a kind of wisdom. He paused. You showed me it was a kind of cowardice. Not by telling me, just by being what you are. Doing what you do. Carrying what you carried alone for 3 months because it was right. Mara was quiet. The cold was sharp around her. The lantern in her shop window threw its small square of light onto the street between them. It wasn't cowardice, she said. You just hadn't found the right door yet. You were the door, he said simply. She looked at him. She thought about the coat, the $1.50, the 50 cents she had given back, the cup of coffee she had offered him the first time she decided to trust him. The small, sequential, honest steps of two people finding